Hello. Happy storybook time. We're on chapter 3. Oh, I'm sorry. I am aware that this microphone's pretty sensitive. So I'm sorry about the sound of the paper. Alright. Chapter 3. The Great Brain Saves the Day. With the end of the silent treatment, I could look forward to 3 big events. School was over for the year. Tom and Sven promised to teach me how to swim. And I was going to mate my dog Brownie with a dog named Lady. Brownie was the only dog we'd ever owned who wasn't a mongrel. He was a purebred Alaskan. A ranger who was a friend of Papa's had given me the pup on my 5th birthday. I guess because Brownie was a thoroughbred, it made him different. He didn't run and play with other dogs, but he would fight them if they wanted to fight. He was such a good fighter that it wasn't long until every dog in town was afraid of him. If any dog came near him, Brownie would show his teeth and begin to growl and chase them away. Every kid in town who owned a female dog wanted to mate it with Brownie, but my dog wanted nothing to do with them. It sure looked as if Brownie would never be a father, until the Jensen brothers got a sheepdog named Lady from their uncle. Lady was the first dog that Brownie didn't chase away when she came near him. To my surprise, he even ran and played with her. I knew Tom had this on his mind when he approached me with the proposition. We were sitting on our back porch steps, just sort of lazily enjoying the beginning of the summer vacation. "JD," Tom said, "let me arrange to mate Brownie with Lady, and I'll see to it that you get the pick of the litter of pups." "I don't need you to arrange it," I said, thinking he was going to charge me for it. "As the owner of the male dog, I get the pick of the litter anyway." "You'll probably pick the worst pup in the litter," he said. He had me there. All puppies look alike to me. "How much is this going to cost me?" I asked cautiously. "How could you think such a thing?" Tom asked indignantly. "You know I'm very sharp when it comes to judging puppies. I just don't want my own brother to get stung." "You mean you'll do it for nothing?" I asked, unable to believe my ears. "Of course, JD," he said, "but we'll have to wait until Lady's in heat." "What's heat?" I asked. "A female dog can have pups twice a year. We have interruptions. Please excuse the real time that life does us." I'm going to have to tell them, busy ATM, hit me up. I guess that's how you say it. HMU, do you kids today? In an hour, please. Oh, guess what I learned? There. What, you couldn't see. You couldn't see. All right. Boo. Okay. "Of course, JD," he said, "but we'll have to wait until Lady's in heat." "What's heat?" I asked. "A female dog can have pups twice a year," Tom said. "At that time of the year is when she's in heat." "Well, how do you know when it happens?" I asked. "For one thing, a female dog will start acting kind of silly every time she sees a male dog," he answered. And when in heat, the female dog gives off a particular odor. When the male dog smells this odor, he knows the female dog wants to mate." "It's a deal," I said. "And remember, you said there would be no charge." And one more pause, please. I told me that I was supposed to hit him up in an hour. Let me say, wait, is that my message or his message? I'll just say him, okay. Hey, this happens in real life. Cool. And you kids were born in the modern times. You know all about these interruptions. And Grandma's getting distracted. Shh, shh, shh. Back to the story. Bum, 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 bum. It's a deal, I said. And remember, you said there would be no charge. A few days later during breakfast, Tom and Sven told Papa that they were going to take me down to the river and teach me how to swim that afternoon. I was so excited that I thought the morning would never end. And then after lunch, we had to wait an hour before we could go swimming, knowing that if we went any sooner, we might get cramps. We ran into Frank and Alan Jensen on our way to the river. They had Lady with them. Frank was Tom's age, and his brother was the same age as Sven. They were blonde kids, with hair that was almost white. Shocks of it protruded from beneath their caps like bangs over their foreheads. "Ladies in heat now," Alan said. "How about bringing Brownie over to our place tomorrow, and we'll put them in the barn?" "We'll be there," Tom said. "Now you fellas going swimming?" Slim asked. "No," Alan said. "We're going exploring. Want to come along?" "We can't today," Tom said. "We promised J.D. to teach J.D. how to swim." We left the Jensen brothers and Lady and continued on to the swimming hole in the river. We stripped naked. There were about a dozen kids already swimming and diving as I followed Tom and Sven to the bank of the river. Sven then led me into the river until the water was up to my armpits. "I'm going to hold your chin, J.D., he said. "You paddle dog fashion and kick your legs." I was scared, but felt safe as long as Sven was holding my chin as he took me into deeper water. "Now keep paddling and kicking," Sven said as he let go of my chin. My head went under water. I tried to scream, only to swallow more water. I was sure I was going to drown and let everybody know it was my... and let everybody know it as my head came up above the water. Sven grabbed a hold of my hair and pulled me to shallow water. He and Tom looked completely disgusted as they led me out of the river. Tom looked at Sven. "Well?" he asked. "I guess it's the only way," Sven said. My eldest brother grabbed me and picked me up in his arms. I screamed bloody murder and tried to wriggle loose. He held me tight as he carried me up the plank, used as a diving board, over to the deepest part of the swimming hole. I knew this was how almost every kid in town learned to swim, but I wanted no part of it. "Let me go!" I screamed. "I'll drown for sure!" "You won't drown," Sven said. "You just keep paddling dog fashion with your hands and kicking your legs, and you won't drown. And it won't do you any good to yell for help, J.D., because I'm not going to jump in after you." "Please let me go," I begged, more afraid than I'd ever been in my life. "Stop that blubbering," Sven ordered me, "or I'll tell Papa that you acted like a coward and a disgrace the name of the Fitzgeralds before all these kids." I stopped bawling. Sven had given me no other choice. I might as well drown as have him tell Papa I was a coward. "Here you go, J.D., Sven yelled. Let's try this again. "Here you go, J.D., Sven yelled as he tossed me from the diving board into the deepest part of the swimming hole. He sounded as if he enjoyed drowning his own brother. I hit the water and went down until my feet touched the bottom. I tried to scream and to get a bellyful of air. I began paddling with my hands and kicking my legs like 60. Then my head came up out of the water and I breathed in air. "Attaboy!" I heard Tom yell. I was too interested in saving my own life to pay attention to him. I was sure going to drown before he reached the bank of the river. Then my fingers touched mud. I never knew mud could feel so good as I crawled up the riverbank. Sven and Tom patted me on the back. "You swam more than 20 feet, Sven said." Tom nodded. "But next time, don't scream and yell," he said. "Keep your mouth shut." "Next time?" I asked, feeling myself getting sick inside. "As soon as you get your wind," Tom said. "Right," Sven said. "And this time, you're going to run and jump off the diving board all by yourself." "I am not," I said as I started for my clothes. "I'm going home." Swin grabbed me. "You run and jump off that diving board, or I'll keep throwing you off it until you do. And we'll let the kids chaw rip beef your clothes," Tom threatened. I don't know if I was more frightened of jumping off the diving board or having my clothes chaw raw beefed. A kid had to be disliked a lot to have his clothes chaw raw beefed, which consisted of soaking them in the river and then tying the socks, shirt, pants, and underwear in tight knots. "Papa and Mama will never forgive you two if I drown," I said, feeling like a martyr. "And," Tom said, "they will never forgive you if you turn out a coward." I knew there was no way out. Every kid in the swimming hole was watching as I started for the diving board. My legs trembled so much I could hardly walk. I was only 8 years old and going to my death. I stopped as I reached the diving board. I looked down the river. All I had to do was run down the riverbank into the bushes. But if I did, I could never go home again. I was pretty young to go into the mountains and live like a naked savage. If I ran now, I would be a coward. Better by far to drown than to disgrace my family name. I took a deep breath and ran right up the diving board and jumped into the swimming hole. This time I held my breath and kept my mouth shut as I paddled and kicked my way to the surface. Then I began paddling furiously with my arms and kicking my legs. The next thing I knew, I reached the riverbank. All the kids ran up to congratulate me. It was the proudest moment of my life. I wasn't afraid of the water anymore. As soon as I got my wind, I ran and jumped off the diving board again. As I waited on the front porch with Tom and Swin, I was waiting on the front porch with Tom and Swin when Papa came home from the Aidenville Weekly Advocate office that evening. "Well, J.D., Papa said, smiling at me, "did you learn how to swim today?" "Yes, Papa," I said, and had to restrain myself not to brag about it. "He's a regular duck," Swin said. "He ran and jumped off the diving board and swam to the riverbank a dozen times." Papa took out his purse and removed a quarter. "I think you deserve a reward, J.D., for learning how to swim in one day." He handed me the quarter. As soon as Papa entered the house, Tom looked at me. "Now why should Papa give you a quarter when it was S.D. and I who taught you how to swim?" "Of course, J.D., if you want to be greedy and keep it all to yourself, I guess that's your business." I was feeling too proud of myself. I would have gladly shared the quarter with my brothers on the spot if Swin hadn't come to my rescue. "For gosh sakes, J.D., as if disgusted with Tom, "can't you let somebody have a nickel to themselves without trying to connive them out of it?" Then he looked at me. "Go put that money in your bank, J.D., before the great brain figures out a way to take it from you." We were eating supper that evening when the telephone rang, with one long ring and two short rings. "Oh, that's for us," Mama said as she got up from the table. Mama went into the hallway to answer the phone. When she returned, she looked worried. "That was Mrs. Jensen," she said as she sat down at the table. Did you boys see Frank or Alan today?" Tom nodded. "We met them on our way to the swim hole this afternoon." "Didn't they go swimming with you?" Mama asked. "No," Tom answered. "They said they were going exploring." "What's the matter, Tina?" Papa asked. "They didn't come home for supper," Mama answered. "Well, the boys probably didn't realize how late it was getting," Papa said. "Just the same," Mama said, "I'm going over there as soon as we finish eating. You boys help Bertha with the dishes." Papa didn't appear worried until it was almost our bedtime when Uncle Mark stopped by. Uncle Mark came into the parlor, the light from the chandelier shining on the marshal's badge pinned to his shirt. "I'm going to organize a posse to search for the Jensen boys," he told Papa with a worried look on his deeply tanned face. Tom laid aside the World Almanac, which he had been reading. "I can give you a clue, Uncle Mark," he said. "Alan had a candle sticking out of his hip pocket when we met him and Frank this afternoon. They told us they were going exploring." "I was afraid of that," Mark said. The boys were last seen going near Skeleton Cave. I couldn't blame Uncle Mark for being worried. The first thing every kid in Aidenville had to promise when they went exploring was not to go near Skeleton Cave. It was a mammoth cave that had never been explored. Papa had told us the cave apparently had several levels, with passages and labyrinths extending for miles. The only part of the cave that had been explored was a big entrance chamber and a passageway leading to a smaller chamber. In the smaller chamber, there were fantastic limestone and stalactite formations. Passages led off from the smaller chamber in two directions. It was called Skeleton Cave because two skeletons had been found inside of the smaller chamber. Papa put on his hat and coat and left with Uncle Mark. Mama came home a few minutes later. She made us boys go straight to bed. I was so frightened I didn't think I could fall asleep. When I did, I had a nightmare about Tom and me being lost in a cave. When Tom, Sven, and I entered the kitchen for breakfast the next morning, I could tell Mama's eyes that she'd been crying. Papa looked as if he'd been up all night. "Did they find them?" Sven asked as we sat down for the big kitchen table. Papa shook his head as he helped himself to some fried eggs and bacon from the big platter on the table. "There isn't any doubt. The boys are lost in the cave," he said. Tom, Sven, and I ate as fast as Mama would let us. Then she made us remain at the table until Papa was through eating. We ran all the way to Cedar Ridge, where the entrance to Skeleton Cave was located. It looked as if the whole population of Aidenville was on Cedar Ridge, standing around in large and small groups. We arrived just as Uncle Mark drove up with Mr. Harmon of the ZCMI store, sitting beside him on the wagon seat. I could see 6 bales of half-inch rope and a dozen lanterns in the wagon. Uncle Mark drove the team right up to the entrance to Skeleton Cave. "What are they going to do?" I asked with a feeling of awe. "The rope is so the search party can find their way back out of the cave," Tom explained. "And they will need the lanterns for light. Let's go someplace where we can see into the bigger chamber of the cave." Sven and I followed Tom to a big boulder. Sven boosted me and Tom up first. Then Tom lay on his belly, with me sitting on his legs to hold him steady while he helped Sven up. From the top of the boulder we could see right into the big entrance of the cave. Uncle Mark, Mr. Harmon, Mr. Jensen, and a half a dozen other men quickly unloaded the wagon. Then Uncle Mark took one end of the bale of rope and tied it securely to a big boulder in the entrance chamber. Then, with several men helping him, Uncle Mark began unwinding the bale of rope and coiling the rope carefully. When they finished with the first bale, Uncle Mark tied the end of it to the beginning of the next bale, and they began unwinding that bale, with Uncle Mark coiling the rope carefully. They kept doing this until all 6 bales of rope had been spliced together, and they had one continuous piece of rope. Those are 500-foot bales of rope," Tom said. "That means the searching party can enter the cave for a distance of 3,000 feet. We watched. Don't watch me be impatient. We watched as Uncle Mark took one end of the spliced rope and tied it around his waist. Then he picked up a lantern and lighted it. We saw him motion to Mr. Jensen and several other men to pick up lanterns and light them. Then, with Uncle Mark in the lead, and with Mr. Jensen and the 5 other men, each carrying a lighted lantern, holding onto the rope, they all disappeared into the passageway leading to the smaller chamber of the cave. I lay on my stomach on the big boulder and watched with a feeling of horror as the spliced coil of rope began to slowly unwind. Deeper and deeper into the cave the search party went as the rope continued to uncoil. And finally, the end of the rope tied to the boulder by Uncle Mark became taut. "That's as far as they can go," Sven said. "They'll have to get more rope," Tom said, "so they can go even deeper into the cave." Sven turned his head. I guess that's why Papa's coming up the ridge with Bishop Aidan, I said. I turned around and saw Papa with the Mormon bishop, whose long beard and appeared pure white when contrasted with the wide-brimmed black hat the Mormon bishop always wore. I didn't understand what Swin meant. What was Papa being with Bishop Aidan got to do with getting more rope? I asked. Well, they will have to get more rope from Cedar City, and the ZCMI store there is probably the only place that carries it, Sven answered. Well, how come they've only got stores owned by Mormons, the Mormon church in Utah? I asked. Shucks, JD. There are other stores in the larger towns and in the cities. How come they don't have any in the small towns? I asked. Because the people who live in small towns are mostly Mormons, Tom said, and the Mormons must give their business to the store owned by their church. We watched Papa and Bishop Aidan enter the entrance chamber of the cave, where they stood waiting until the search party returned. The men in the search party came through the passageway leading to the small chamber, just the opposite of the order they went in. With Mr. Jensen in the lead and Uncle Mark coming out last. They had left the rope in the cave and found their way back by following it. Uncle Mark put down his lantern and gave an order we couldn't hear. I watched as several men began pulling the rope from the cave and coiling it. Then Uncle Mark began talking to Papa and Bishop Aidan. Tom looked up at the sun. It's time for lunch, he said. Papa arrived home just moments before we did. He appeared to be worried. He just pecked at his homemade sausages and mashed potatoes and gravy. Bishop Aidan sent a telegram to Cedar City this morning, he told Mama. They sent a wire back saying they would send all the rope they had on hand at the CZMI store there. They are sending it by team and wagon rather than wait for the next train. It should arrive here this afternoon. Is there any hope? Mama asked. There's always hope, Papa said. But Mark told us the passageways after you get into the cave always run out in all directions. It's going to take time to explore them all. I can't help blaming myself in a way. But why? Mama asked. As editor and publisher of the Aidenville Weekly Advocate, I should have demanded in editorials a long time ago that the entrance to the cave be dynamited shut, Papa said. My two brothers and I were back on the top of the boulder on Cedar Ridge when the wagon load of rope arrived from the Cedar City that afternoon. The team pulling the wagon was covered with lather and had been driven hard. There were 8 bales of rope in the wagon. We watched the rope being unloaded and spliced to the other rope and then coiled until one continuous piece of rope made a large pile in the big chamber of the cave. With those 8 bales, Tom said, added to the other 6 bales, the search party can now penetrate a distance of 7,000 feet into the cave. That's more than a mile. We aren't going to be able to watch it, Swin said. By the time we get home and do our chores, it'll be time for supper. Mama made us go to bed at our usual time that night, despite our protests. The next morning, at breakfast, we learned from Papa that Frank and Alan and Lady hadn't been found. Although the search had gone on all through the night, We had just finished eating when Uncle Mark came into the house. He had a 2-day growth of beard on his face and had been without sleep for 2 nights. Oh, this chapter's going to be a tiny bit longer than yesterday, but we had a few interruptions and, getting tired. I'd like to see you alone, he said to Papa. They went into the parlor with Papa shutting the sliding doors between the dining room and the parlor. I followed Tom out to our backyard because I knew what he was going to do. His great brain had long ago figured out a way to eavesdrop on anybody in our parlor. We were without doubt the best informed kids in town on things parents didn't want their children to hear. I watched Tom climb up to the roof of our back porch and then crawl up the edge of the roof until he was on top of the house. I held my breath as he stood up like a tightrope walker and walked across the pointed top of the roof until he came to the chimney for the fireplace in our parlor. He got a hold of the top of the stone chimney, and, using a crack for a footrest, hoisted himself up until his head was above the chimney. My brother had told me the stone chimney of the fireplace magnified voices in our parlor so he could hear every word spoken. I waited nervously for Tom, who seemed to be taking his time listening. At last, I saw him come back down. His freckled face was grim as he jumped down from the roof of our back porch and joined me. Uncle Mark doesn't seem to think they will ever find Frank Allen and Lady, he told me. Is he going to give up? I asked, shivering, as I thought of poor Frank Allen and Lady, doomed to die in the blackness of Skeleton Cave. They're going to keep trying, Tom said, but Uncle Mark says it is hopeless. He told Papa the search party found an underground river in the cave, and Frank Allen and Lady could have fallen into it and drowned. He said that the current is so swift it could have carried them all to their deaths. Gosh, J.D., I said sadly, that means that Frank, Allen, and Lady are goners for sure. Even if they're alive, Tom said. Uncle Mark told Papa that they're probably going further and further into the cave trying to find their way out. And he said it would take an army months to fully explore all levels of the cave. Tom shook his head. If they don't find them alive, it's going to cost me a fortune. How do you mean it'll cost you a fortune? I asked. Skip it, J.D., Tom said quickly, too quickly. Well, maybe your great brain can save the day. I'm sorry. Well, maybe your great brain could save the day, I said without much hope. Tom straightened up. Now that the grown-ups have just about given up, he said, I guess it is up to me to save Frank Allen and Lady. I'll put my great brain to work on it. We walked to our barn. Tom gave me orders to stand guard and not let anybody in the barn. Then he went into the barn and climbed up the rope ladder to his loft to put his great brain to work. I was disappointed when Mama called us for lunch. Tom came down from his loft when I hollered up to him. He reported that his great brain hadn't come up with a plan for saving Frank Allen and Lady. But don't worry, J.D., he said confidently. My great brain never fails me. After we'd eaten lunch, Tom went back up to his loft while I stood guard outside the barn. Brownie came into the corral. He wanted to play. I always played and romped and wrestled with Brownie because he never played with the other dogs before Lady came along. He began barking as we started to play. I was afraid the barking would disturb Tom and tried to make Brownie stop. He thought this was more playing and started barking louder. The barn door suddenly opened and Tom came out. I thought he was going to be mad at me for letting Brownie bark. Instead, he flashed me a triumphant grin. I knew my great brain would save the day, he said. Come with me, J.D., and bring Brownie with you. Tom led us right up to and into the big entrance chamber of Skeleton Cave. Several men were there, including Mr. Jensen, who was arguing with Uncle Mark. Now, what kind of a marshal are you? My 2 boys are lost in that cave, and it's your job to find them. I can only push my search party so far, Uncle Mark said patiently. We haven't had a wink of sleep in 2 days. Just give us a few hours to get some rest, and then we'll continue the search. Tom walked up to Uncle Mark. He tapped his finger on his forehead. My great brain has figured out a way to save Frank Allen and Lady, he said. Mr. Jensen pushed Tom to one side. Get that boy out of here, he ordered Uncle Mark. This is no time for kids and their kid games. Don't you dare shove that boy again, Uncle Mark said. Then he looked at Tom. If you have any idea how to rescue the Jensen boys, please tell me. First, we have to go to the Jensen place, Tom said. Then we have to stop at the meat market. Of all the infernal nonsense, Mr. Jensen said. Marshal, get this boy out of here and get on with the search. Look, Mr. Jensen, Uncle Mark said sharply. I'm grabbing at straws, and so should you by this time. Then he took off his holster and revolver and handed them to Don Huddle, the blacksmith. I'm making you deputy marshal, Don, he said. Stand guard, and don't let anybody go into that cave. And that goes for Mr. Jensen, too. He then looked down at my brother. Let's go, Tom. J.D. and Brownie have to come, too, Tom said. I was thrilled and grateful to be included. Tom led the way to the Jensen home and around to Lady's doghouse in the backyard. Lady is in heat, Tom said. I want Brownie to get inside her doghouse and smell that Lady is in heat. Brownie began to whimper as he entered the doghouse, and he smelled around in it. And Tom led the way to this Deseret meat market. We want a big piece of beef liver, he told Mr. Thompson, the butcher. Uncle Mark tried to pay for the meat. Mr. Thompson refused to take any money when told the liver was being used to try and rescue the Jensen brothers. Doesn't make sense, Mr. Thompson said, but take it with my blessing. When we entered into the entrance chamber of the cave, Mr. Jensen was sitting on a rock crying. Tom sat down on the ground. He rubbed the piece of liver on the soles of his shoes and then handed the meat to Uncle Mark. Brownie has the scent of Lady being in heat, he told Uncle Mark. He will find Lady for us in the cave, and Frank and Alan will be with her. We will stop every once in a while and rub the liver on the soles of our shoes. This will give Brownie a scent to lead us back out of the cave. Uncle Mark grinned as he sat down and rubbed liver on the soles of his shoes. The next time I need a Sherlock Holmes, he said, I'll know where to go. Papa came into the cave as Uncle Mark was lighting a lantern. He looked at Tom and then at Uncle Mark. What's going on here? He asked. Tom has figured out a way to find the Jensen boys, if they're alive, Tom answered. Don't you think for 1 minute I'm going to let you take my... I'm sorry. You don't think for a minute I'm going to let my son go into that cave without a search party, do you? Papa demanded. We're depending on Lady being in heat to give Brownie the scent that will enable him to lead us to her, Uncle Mark explained. If I take a search party along, it'll distract the dog. And I've also got to take Tom with me so that Brownie will have somebody he knows and trusts along. Don't worry, Papa, Tom said confidently. We'll be back in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail with Frank, Alan, and Lady. If anything happens to you, son, Papa said, and I knew how concerned he must be when he called Tom son. I'll never forgive myself. Nothing's going to happen to me, Tom said. Can we go now, please? Are you afraid? Heck no, Tom said, as if becoming impatient with Papa. Papa looked at Uncle Mark. I know you wouldn't do this if you didn't think it was safe, he said. I can't deny there's some risk, Uncle Mark said. But we've got to think about those boys in there. Papa knelt in the dirt and embraced Tom. Good luck, son, he said, as his voice was husky. I wasn't the least bit scared. Maybe it was my confidence in my brother's big brain. Maybe it was my confidence in my dog. I felt no fear at all as I watched Uncle Mark enter the passageway to the cave. In the one hand he held a rope leash which he had attached to Brownie, and in the other hand he carried the lighted lantern. Tom followed, carrying the piece of liver wrapped in the brown paper they had gotten from the meat market. They had been gone about 15 minutes when Mrs. Jensen and Mama came into the entrance chamber of the cave. Mrs. Jensen walked over to where her husband was sitting on the rock. What are the Marshal and Tina's 2 boys doing around the lady's doghouse? She asked. Mr. Jensen looked up at his wife. The Marshal thinks that Fitzgerald's boy's dog might find Lady from her scent in the cave. He said, there is still hope, my dear. Mama just stood there staring at Papa, but saying nothing. I had to let the boy try it, Papa finally said. Mark said it was the only way. Mama still said nothing as she walked over and put her hand in Papa's. Just then, Swin came running into the cave's chamber. He looked at Papa and Mama and then sat down on the chamber floor beside me. "What's going on?" he whispered. I told him. Swin shook his head when I finished. "Old TD sure has courage," he said. "I wouldn't venture into the cave for anything." "I would have gone with them if Uncle Mark had asked me," I said. "Like fun you would," Swin said loudly. "They say there are monsters and a big snake in the cave." "That'll be enough of that," Papa said sternly as Mama made the sign of a cross. Don Huddle, who was standing guard near the entrance of the chamber of the cave, let Mrs. Olson and Mrs. Winters enter. They were Mrs. Jensen's next-door neighbors. They were carrying a big wicker basket between them. They set the basket down in the middle of the chamber and removed a tablecloth from it. The basket was filled with sandwiches, glasses, and 2 big jugs of milk. I knew the way Papa and Mama were feeling at that moment. They would rather have had a cup of coffee than anything. But Mrs. Olson and Mrs. Winters were Mormons, and the Mormons never drank coffee because it was against their religion. Just as they never drank tea or any kind of alcoholic beverages or smoked any kind of tobacco. All the grown-ups in the chamber except Mr. and Mrs. Jensen accept the sandwich and a glass of milk from the 2 ladies. Then Mrs. Winters finally coaxed them into having a sandwich and a glass of milk. All the adults had been served, and it was now time for Swin and me to dive into the basket and gorge ourselves on ham and roast chicken and roast beef sandwiches, and then top it off with a glass of milk. After we had eaten our fill, time began moving so slowly that it seemed as if the whole world had come to a halt. I asked Papa the time so many times that he threatened to send me home if I asked again. But after 3 hours had passed, Papa himself began looking at his watch every few minutes. He became so nervous that Mama got suspicious. "Is there anything you haven't told me?" she asked. "Mark did say there was some risk," Papa admitted. At first I thought Mama would start crying, but she didn't. She put her hand in Papa's and stood straight and brave. Another hour passed very slowly. Mrs. Jensen began crying as her husband held her in his arms, trying to comfort her. Mama stood staring at the entrance to the passageway. Papa paced nervously back and forth. Then Don Huddle left his guard post at the entrance to the cave to walk over to Papa. "We'll give them an hour, Fritz, and if they don't come back by then, we'll send a search party in for them." Swin shook his head and whispered to me, "Maybe old TD's a goner." I thought I heard a dog bark. Then I was sure of it. I jumped to my feet. "That's Brownie!" I shouted. We all ran to the entrance of the passageway. I could now hear both Brownie and Lady barking. Then I saw a flicker of light down the passageway. Swin slapped me on the shoulder. "Old TD and his great brain did it!" he shouted. "TD my eye," I said, feeling left out of the glory. "What good would his great brain have been without my dog?" Mrs. Jensen clapped her hands in prayer. "Please, God," she prayed, "please let my sons be with them." Then we heard Uncle Mark shout, "All safe and sound. I'm going to release the dogs now." And they're tearing my arm off. Brownie and Lady came running toward the chamber a moment later. Brownie ran over to me. I knelt and put my arms around him as he licked my face and barked happily. Then he broke away from me. He barked at Lady, and they ran out of the cave together. The sight of the 2 dogs coming out of the cave brought a cheer from the waiting crowd outside. Inside the chamber, everything was just as mushy as could get as Uncle Mark, Tom, Frank, and Alan came out of the passageway. Nobody waited for Uncle Mark to untie the ropes around their waists. Frank and Alan kept blinking their eyes as their mother and father hugged and kissed them. I guess the light hurt their eyes after being in the darkness so long. Papa and Mama were fussing over Tom as if he'd returned from a long sea voyage. Swin was running around, patting everybody on the back as if he were responsible for the rescue. Uncle Mark and Don Huddle were slapping each other on the shoulders and laughing loudly. The rest of the people in the chamber were hugging each other, shaking hands, patting each other on the back, and carrying on like you never saw. My dog had made the rescue possible, and nobody was paying attention to me. Tom no sooner got the rope off his waist than Mr. Jensen picked him up and put my brother on his shoulder. He carried Tom out of the chamber, with the rest of us following. The crowd outside began to applaud and cheer as they saw Mr. Jensen, Tom, and Frank, and Alan. Several men got so excited they began shooting their revolvers in the air. Mr. Jensen held up one hand for silence. The crowd began to quiet immediately. "My sons owe their lives to this brave boy on my shoulders," Mr. Jensen shouted. The crowd went wild, whistling, shouting, applauding, as if Tom were some kind of king. Then Uncle Mark held up his hands for silence. "The Jensen boys are exhausted and very hungry," he shouted. "I could use some rest myself. Please make way for us and let us go home." The crowd made a pathway for Mr. Jensen as Mr. Jensen put Tom down. They kept cheering and reaching out to pat my brother on the shoulder as we walked down Cedar Ridge with Mama and Papa. They even followed us home and stood in the street in front of our house. I followed Mama, Papa, Sven, and Tom into our parlor. Tom walked into the big bay window and looked out at the crowd on the street. "I guess I'll have to speak to them," he said. Papa winked at Mama. "I think that would be a good idea, TD. I started to follow Tom out to the front porch to share in the boughs because it was my dog. "Let him go alone, JD, Papa said. This is his day." Far be it from me to be jealous, but this was getting to be sickening. Everybody was hailing my brother as a hero when my dog was the real hero. My dog couldn't take any bows, but as his owner, I could have taken a few for him. The crowd gave a mighty cheer as Tom appeared on the front porch. My brother held up his hands for silence. The crowd obeyed him. When I learned that Uncle Mark and the search party were about to give up the search as hopeless, he said, with about as much modesty as a plucked chicken hanging in the window of the Deseret Meat Market, I knew the only way to save Frank, Alan, and Lady was to put my great brain to work. I would have done it sooner, but I wanted to give the grown-ups every chance. When they failed, I knew it was up to me to save the day. And now, folks, please go home. I've got to rest up my great brain so it'll be ready the next time something happens which you grown-ups can't solve. I expected the crowd of grown men and women to throw rotten eggs at Tom after the way he insulted them. Instead, they cheered and applauded. Papa looked at Mama and smiled. "What a modest son we have," he said. "You can't deny," Mama said, "that his great brain did make fools out of Mark and the rest of the men in this town." "What about my dog?" I asked, feeling completely left out. Mama and Papa had no ears for me as their conquering hero came back into the parlor. They fussed over him right up until it was time for us boys to go to bed that night. I only had a little brain, but it only took a little brain to figure it all out. If I hadn't been playing with Brownie, making my dog bark when Tom was up in his loft, the great brain might have never got the idea of using my dog for the rescue. One other thing that bothered me, and I asked Tom about it as we were getting undressed for bed that night. "What did you mean when you said it would cost you a fortune if Frank, Alan, and Lady were not found alive?" I asked. Tom held his undershirt half over his head and peered out of it like a photographer taking a picture. "It's a business deal I made with them," he answered. "What kind of deal?" I asked, because I was curious. Tom whipped off his undershirt. "That's none of your business," he said. The only business deal I knew about with Frank and Alan was that I would get the pick of the litter from Brownie and Lady's pups. I couldn't help feeling before I fell asleep that somehow, and in some way, I was going to end up with the short end of the deal. And oh, how I wished I had a great brain like my brother's so I could figure it out. The end of chapter 3. Well, that really did go on. Alright, good night. There's only 8 chapters in the whole book, so I'll be done inside a week, and then we'll do something new.